Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to be showing you how to paint an eagle's beak in acrylics. So this here is a section of this month's tutorial on Patreon. It will be a full-length tutorial where you've got everything from start to finish, the background to those final details, and if that's of interest I'll link that in the description below. And at the end of this tutorial I will have a photograph of the finished painting so you can see exactly what that background, the sky, the mountains, all of that looks like with this impressive bird of prey. So for the very first element here, if you've seen many of my other tutorials here on YouTube, you'll know that I put a lot of focus on that base layer, and this is what I'm starting to do here. Now at the moment I'm moving my hand, I'm moving the brush to explain exactly what I'm doing, because this tutorial on Patreon is uploaded in a real-time tutorial with a voiceover while I'm working, so that every single process, each detail, every brushstroke is explained thoroughly. Now going back to those base layers, now I want to make sure that I've got this fairly accurate and I want to get it as close to that reference photo as I can. So what I'm starting to do here is map in my lights and my darks and selecting my main reference points. Now for me, a reference points are something in that reference photo with the specific element that I'm working on that I notice first. I want to make sure I've got those mapped in so that I've got something accurate that when I look back at my reference photo and back at my painting, I know exactly where I am. So in this case, it's going to be the dark line that separates the bottom part of the beak from the top section of the beak and then that nostril. Now what you can see I'm doing here is I am using titanium white paint. That's it, pretty much straight from the tube, and I'm going to wait for that to dry. The reason being, depending on some brands of acrylic paint, they can be a little bit more transparent than others. Now Liquitex Basics is one of those brands, but I personally like that about that paint because I really do like working with glazes, and we'll get to that in the later stage of this tutorial. A common complaint that some of the colours can get is that they are too transparent and they show that background colour through. Now in some cases this transparency works really well, and again that's why I love them for my glazes. But for this instance here, when I was trying to apply the yellow and orange colours, it was showing too much of that blue background and you end up creating something that looks a bit more of like a muddier green colour. I really didn't want that. So to fix that problem, I've put a layer of my titanium white down first. I'm going to wait for that to dry, and as you can see here, when I go over the top with a yellow, it's far more vibrant and punchy. This is because you've put an opaque colour down first, which is the titanium white, and then you're applying your vibrant transparent colours on top. You therefore have covered the background colour so that these transparent colours can show up in their true form. And I've just mentioned about the opaque layer. Now this is that titanium white and it's very important. What opaque means is that you cannot see through that paint, and you want that here because it does need to hide that background. Whilst I was waiting for that to dry, I then carry on refining a little bit more of the beak and then mapping in that very first base layer of the lower section of the beak. Now it's very common at this stage that you see the individual brush strokes. You can see here that everything looks rather streaky. Now that is normal, it's meant to look like this at this stage. It's all about how we layer. So now that I'm going to be applying this yellow-orange colour, you can see the massive difference between the top section of the beak and the bottom section of the beak. The top section now looks far more vibrant and brighter in colour. Now this was deliberate. I didn't put the white on the lower part of the beak because that lowest part of the beak there is in shadow, so I didn't mind that it was a little bit darker. But certainly for the top part, if I hadn't have used this white, I wouldn't have been able to have captured this really bright punchy colour. Now although the beak doesn't have any texture like fur, I'm still layering up this process, and this is so important, and I show this on every single tutorial that I've got here on YouTube, and I cover it extensively in my slower tutorials on Patreon. If we skip layers to try and get that painting done quicker, we just won't have the same degree of depth. And even though, as I say, this beak has no fur, of course, it's more of that smoother, shinier surface, I still have to build up my layers gradually. There'd be no point in me jumping to my brightest highlights first and skipping out all of that in between layers, because this here will not have that shine. It won't have those subtle shadows, nor will it have the texture of the beak either. The texture of some beaks, and it's going to vary from bird to bird, but they're going to have scratches, they're going to have indentations there that we want to capture. If we add those in too early on, they're going to look very two-dimensional. So in order to build up our layers, it's all going to help to make those type of textures more three-dimensional. So before we start working on the details and those glazes, if the tips and techniques that I've shared so far have been useful, I would really appreciate it if you could give the video a thumbs up, because it makes a huge difference. So here, what I'm starting to do is build up more of my mid colours. So again, I don't want there to be any harsh start and stop points between my lights and my darks. If you look at the photo in the corner here, the finished beak is all soft and transitional. There are no harsh edges apart from that dark line that separates the two parts of the beak and the nostril. One of the other elements to do with acrylics that I cover in depth in my slower tutorials on Patreon is the blending technique. Now, blending acrylics can be harder and more challenging because of their fast drying time, but I personally love that about this. This is why I switched over from using oils and now why I always use my acrylics. I like the fact that they dry fast because I'm able to get that painting done in a shorter space of time. That being said, I can slow down that drying time if I need to by using a couple of techniques. The one main technique is using a fine mist sprayer bottle, and you can use that by applying a layer of water over the top, and that will prevent that paint from drying as quickly. You are then often able to get very similar results to what you can with oils. Now again, if those sorts of techniques, the blending, how to slow that paint down, keep that wet for as long as you want, then my Patreon tutorials may be of interest, and I will link that in the description below. I've also got a Patreon library on my website where you can see every single tutorial that's available there before you sign up. And the wonderful thing with Patreon, it's very flexible, and that's why I do love it. You can stay for as long as you want, or you can cancel at any time. So the one thing that you'll notice here is that I'm really emphasising the correct direction of my brush strokes. Now I have a video here and it's my top tips for painting realistic fur. I'll link that in the description if that's of interest. And although I'm not painting fur here, the direction of my highlights and my shadows on the beak are just as important. If I get the curves of the highlights and those shadows incorrect, I will change the shape of the beak. And of course, then it may not resemble as much like this animal as it should. Birds of prey have very distinctive beaks, so I want to make sure that I got this accurate from the very beginning, just as much as the eye itself. Now the one thing that I want to point out here is that at the moment I'm applying a couple of layers with the titanium white and then waiting for that to dry and then applying my brighter vibrant yellows on top. I wouldn't normally do this with any other situation. I apply my layers in a slightly different way, and you can see that from all of the tutorials that I've got here on YouTube. However, because with the Liquitex Basics and like many other brands of acrylic paint, the yellows are particularly transparent. So if I didn't put this white down at my various stages, I wouldn't be able to have these brush strokes as visible as what's required, and therefore the texture of the beak just wouldn't be accomplished. So this technique, using your brighter, more opaque layers and then going over the top with glazes, is a really good way to work when you're trying to capture something that's this orange and yellow colour. Now, as you can see from this tutorial and all of the others, I like working in small sections. For me, I find that I'm far more effective and I do get that painting done quicker. When I work with whole set layers, so if I was to do one base layer of the entire bird, wait for that to dry and do a second layer and so on, I find that not only do we have a tendency to rush certain stages, which can then end up with less depth and therefore less realism in the finished painting, but I just find I'm nowhere near as motivated. If I decided to stop this painting session after I'd finished the beak, I could easily leave it here and come back to it the following day, knowing that it's already looking like that photograph. That is just very motivational in itself. So for me, that's always been my preference. I've spoken about why I'm layering this way in order to capture the colour accurately here, but the one thing that's really beneficial with working with acrylics and glazes is you don't have to worry about mixing the exact colour at that very first layer. You can change the colour and get that accurate to that reference photo with glazes later on. And I've got so many videos on Patreon showing you how to do that technique because it is my preference. Something else that I prefer to do is work with smaller brushes. Now this is certainly the case when I'm doing my base layers. If you scroll back to the beginning of this tutorial or any of my other tutorials here, for the area that I'm working on, the brush looks fairly small. Now that is purely because I do think that by capturing more of those lights and darks, those transitions at that early stage, that painting will end up more realistic because we're following that reference photo more closely. If we block in set individual layers early on and we skip past our lights and darks, we'll have a tendency to rush that painting without even realising. So for me, again, that's one of my main reasons why I like to use small brushes. When I build up with my additional details, I'll switch over to intricate brushes like my liner and rigger brushes or those smaller detailed brushes. But I want to make sure for the base layer stage that I'm not using the biggest brush I have in my set to get that colour down quickly, because in some cases that's going to create the opposite effect with what we're trying to go for. So we're nearly done for this section of the tutorial, but I just wanted to show you at what point I start layering some of my details. Now it's only here when I feel like the beak has finished and I don't have to touch any more of those base layers that I start adding the details, and this is really important. Just like with fur, I want to be working with what is closest to the skin and working up from there. So in this case it's what's closest to the beak and building up from there. I don't want to be painting in the feathers that I notice and look like are on top first, because I just won't have the same degree of depth. So it's at this point here where I feel like I'm not going to have to adjust the layers underneath that I start adding in these details. Now, as I've said, you can fix acrylics very easily. If you do feel like you've jumped a layer and you've skipped past something, we can easily paint over it. It's just going to take extra time. So I always want to make sure that I've got that layer underneath in place and I'm happy with it before I start thinking and considering to add any kind of detail. So I do hope this has been useful. If you would like to see this in real time, then I will link my Patreon channel in the description below. And if you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I am more than happy to help if I can. And here is a photograph of my finished painting, and if you would like to get notified of all the future content that I upload, hit the subscribe and the bell button. And as I've said, this is going to feature for October, this month's full-length tutorial, so you can paint along from the very first background stages all the way through to those final details. You get the reference photo, line art and full material list, all of the colours and the brushes that I have used, so it's a perfect one to follow along to.